DogWorks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
You can support this podcast on patreon.com/firstpawmedia.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by First Paw Coffee Company, specializing in private label premium blend coffee. If you're serious about coffee, you should check it out. First Paw Coffee's passion is high-quality, small-batch roasted coffee. They take the extra time to taste and get everything perfect before they release new blends. They aim to bring you a cup of happiness each time you pour yourself some coffee. Find out more at ak.dog/free and enter for a chance to win some First Paw Coffee prizes, a book from our collection, and tote bag. One winner will be selected at random each month. That's ak.dog/free.
From First Paw Media, sponsored by First Paw Coffee Company, this is the Dog Driver Show. Visit our website at dogworksradio.com. Now here are your hosts, Robert Forto and Kourosh Partow.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is Robert and I'm here with my co-host KP and we are the Dog Driver Show. And today we have a guest calling in from Knik, Alaska. KP, who do we have?
We have a local musher today with us, Todd Whitcomb. And Todd has been involved in sled dog sport for many, many years, first as a volunteer and now as a competitor, open class racing, Rendezvous finisher. Really excited to talk to him about his dogs and his passion for the Rendezvous in particular. Todd, welcome to the show and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do with your dogs.
Oh, hey, thank you for having me on, guys. I very much appreciate this. I listen to the show quite a bit, and it's certainly an honor to be on the show and to be able to talk about dogs with you guys. This is great. I guess really I got into dogs. I got into mushing around 2004 when I was living in the Yukon Territory and experienced one of the checkpoints for the Iditarod. And that completely changed my perspective of what working dogs looked like. And I saw what I thought was some of the healthiest, both physically and mentally healthiest animals I'd ever seen in my life. And that one winter kind of changed my perspective. And the next summer I started running tours in Skagway for a company there running some distance dogs and did that for summer. That fall, I did a little bit of training with the kennel that I was working with, just some fun runs, doing some distance stuff. And then I saw a job posting in Anchorage, or outside of Anchorage, for a sprint team. And it was a 100-dog kennel that did sprints, and I didn't quite understand what that meant. So I figured I'd come and just see what it was about. And when I got onto a sprint sled, and instead of doing 8 or 9 miles an hour on a distance sled, I got to feel what 20 miles an hour felt like. And it changed my passion from being interested in dogs to being interested in racing competitive athletes. And it really has become my primary interest is running dogs in a Olympic level of competition. And to me, that is encompassed in the Fur Rondy. While I was living in Anchorage, I started volunteering for the Fur Rondy, and within a couple of years, the board asked me to join them as a board member and as a supporter and organizer of the Fur Rondy and then all the other races that we do. And I've been doing that for about 10 or 11 years now, I think. Kourosh, hasn't it been? Probably about 11 years?
Yeah, probably. Tell us about Rendezvous, Todd. You basically put all your effort, your passion, your lifestyle around this race in particular. A lot of our listeners are not familiar with this race. Tell us what is Rendezvous about.
So, Fur Rendezvous is oftentimes considered the pinnacle event for sprint mushing. It's a 25-mile race. It lasts for 3 days in a row. So for 3 days, they're going to do 25 miles each day. The dogs, the finishers, the winners are often averaging about 20 miles an hour during that race. So it's a 25-mile-an-hour race 20-mile-an-hour race at a 25-mile-an-hour distance, which is just incredible for anyone. And to do that 3 days in a row is amazing. I know you've had Arlie Reynolds talking about the physiology of Fur Rendezvous level dogs, and this definitely highlights some of the most athletic animals that we've ever really studied, is certainly in sled dogs. Fur Rendezvous to me is special because it is, from my understanding of the history, and I'm not a historian, but my understanding of the history is kind of Fur Rondy is what kicked off the worldscape of dog mushing. Back in the 40s when the Fur Rondy was going on, it was the big event of Anchorage. It started out with just a wager between two guys to see who had the faster trapping team. As snow machines evolved in the bush and dog mushing became more of a historical thing, the sport of dog mushing started to pick up, and Fur Rendezvous was kind of the centerpiece of that, certainly in Alaskan culture. So it became the event that the dog mushers that used dogs for trapping or started to build racing teams would come and meter their dogs against all of the other teams that were out there. It was during the oil boom of the 70s that the money in sprint mushing made it something very, very popular, and it actually made it a way for people to make a living. So we have some pretty iconic mushers that were able to support themselves running racing dogs. An interesting part of Fur Rondy is the participants that used to compete for Fur Rondy later on went and created the Iditarod, but they were Fur Rendezvous competitors first, and then decided they wanted a different format to highlight a different aspect of dog culture. But really, we sprinters kind of look at the Fur Rondy as the birthplace of the Iditarod. And I'm sure that will upset a couple distance people, but it's back in that era with working dogs doing long poles as a working team, traveling between villages. The sprint racing was a more entertaining format for people that were going to festivals, and that's I think why it kind of caught on so well. Is that Fur Rondy was just something that you could watch. You watch them leave and come back at the same location. So they start downtown, they end downtown. So you get to see how the teams leave, and you get to see what they look like when they come back. So for people that are into dogs, that shows how good of a team is by how well that team runs back in preparation for the next day. And so Fur Rondy just, for me, was that race and that format that really suited my interest. I love that the athleticism of the dogs at that level. It's a different type of athleticism than you see in the Iditarod. Not better or worse, just different. And the dogs themselves are just amazing animals. Their ability to adjust to stress during a race, during the racing season is amazing. And watching a healthy dog team move through very stressful events that you often see on Fur Rondy, whether it's a loose dog that runs into the trail, a moose that is chasing the team down the trail. There's so many complex things that go on. To watch these dog teams just move right around them like they really aren't an obstacle really shows that level of expertise that both the mushers and the dogs have on being able to focus on what they're doing and not get distracted is just amazing.
Todd, what does it take to become a Rondy finisher? And I'm not saying that lightly.
Well, I will tell you, for me, it was a long haul. I spent about 5 or 6 years on the board before I even started collecting dogs, just learning what it takes to have a Rondy level dog. And to build a Rondy team is no small feat. I had to go back to school just so I could afford it. I needed a better career because it is exceptionally expensive to be able to do this. This is not a sport where people make money, except for that 1% of kennels that can. But most people, this is this is always a losing, you're always losing money in some aspect. You're very rarely breaking even. So you have to have a passion for it. And going into that means that you're going to have to spend a lot of effort and a lot of money to even get onto Fur Rondy, get onto the track. I've finished the race twice now. I've run it twice and I finished it twice, which for me was the goal. I wasn't trying to find placement. I was trying to complete the race because it's such a difficult race. And for a rookie, I felt that was a fairly good expectation. It took me about 3 years of trying to build a team, learning what a Rondy dog looks like compared to a dog that runs shorter formats. We often have dogs that run 6 and 8 miles, and they'll be competitive world-class racing dogs at the 6 and 7 mile formats. But they struggle when you try to take them over 12 miles. So the learning curve of building a team that can compete at that level, at that distance, at that speed, takes an enormous amount of time and effort, and then just learning dogs. I've gotten rescue dogs that some of them have ended up on Rondy teams, and then other rescue dogs that, moved on to 6-dog teams because that's where they excelled at. I've had dogs that we didn't think would even be a sled dog that was the leader of my team the second year I ran Rondy. And this was a dog that we weren't sure if she wanted to be a sled dog. And then she's leading the team. So it is a race that it's a race in a training format that can really surprise you on what the dogs are capable of doing once they understand the expectations of what you're asking. And I think that's one of the hardest things to do is to align the musher to align the expectations in a way that the dogs can understand the limits and what the expectation is. And I think when that happens is when teams really start to click. To be honest, I'm not sure if I've seen that happen yet, but I feel like we're really close.
Todd, you have a small kennel like I do also, and I know you fairly well. You changed like you said, you changed your career, you went back to school, you got a degree, and you moved out of town purposely, close to a trail system. What keeps this motivation going?
The love of dogs does, but I don't know if the love of dogs is enough. Really, I see mushing in general, like what my passion right now isn't so much winning Rondy as promoting dog mushing. And I want to use sprint mushing as a way to do that. The passion that I have is I don't want to lose what I consider to be really historically important connection between dogs and animals outside of the pet mentality. I mean, I have pets. I love pets. I've grown up with pets. My father's a veterinarian. So I understand the pet world. But dogs in the sled capacity, mushing dogs, they've been domesticated for about 10,000 years now. Probably the first organized domestication that we saw of dogs would have been in dog teams. Prior to that, they would have maybe helped with hunting and protection. But really, it was with mushing that you have a change in how animals and humans interact in a really significant way. It's really similar to putting a harness on an ox so that you can plow your fields. That transition for a culture is absolutely huge. I obviously have a little background in anthropology. So to me, that connection between the human and the dog is really important. And the connection of dog mushing helps us remember that history of dogs being a part of our cultural identity for tens of thousands of years now.
Todd, I know you, as I said, fairly well, and I know you started mushing with a smaller team, and then you evolved focusing into the open class driving. How did you evolve your dog teams and your dogs? and why these dogs, they look different from the one you had a few years ago, and give us a little bit of background about your dogs that you have in your yard.
Sure. When I started out, I was in nursing school when I first started getting dogs. I had told myself I would wait till after nursing school, and of course that never happens. So really, we started getting dogs, and I was getting dogs at that time that people were giving away for whatever reason, and accidental breeding, and I got a handful of dogs from that. People were coming through town, from out of town, from Wisconsin, from Canada, and doing little favors for people, helping to hold dogs for them. People would give me a dog here, give me a dog there for, trade for helping them with things. I bought a couple of dogs for fairly inexpensive prices. And what I found is, because, like you said, I had a background in the limited class mushing where we were doing 6 and 8 mile runs, that as I tried to push these dogs that I was able to just kind of collect willy-nilly for about a year or two, I realized that those dogs, although they were great athletes, they weren't the Rondy level open class athletes that I was looking for. And that's something that I just had to learn by running the dogs and watching and seeing what they looked like when we come back from a 10-mile run, and realizing that a couple of dogs just weren't quite making it. So the dogs that I had back then were a little houndier, and I know that we run a lot of hound and sprint, but these were even houndier than what you'd normally see in an open class, and they really were suited well to that 6, 7, 8, 9 mile formats. Over the last 3 years or so, I've been able to connect with, as I started getting into collecting more dogs, some of the open class mushers started recognizing that I was interested in running open, so they started giving me some more pointed input on what type of dogs to get, and I really took that input to heart. And so I've been buying dogs from more established kennels. I might want the runt out of their kennel, out of a litter that they might not think is going to work, but that dog might end up being my best, because I'm not necessarily going to go compete with you, Kourosh. You're going to run your dogs way faster than I do, even in the same race, and it's just the quality of dogs that we have. Someday I would like to be able to compete with you head-to-head in the top 5. That would be amazing. But that's a progression that the kennel has to do by finding the dogs that like and want to do that level of racing, and then my ability to understand how to train them up to that level. And it's a work in progress, and it is grounded in those shorter distances, but it's kind of a whole nother world when you start getting into the 12 and 15 and 17 mile races. The dogs, they get a little, I don't know, like the muscles are not quite as, I almost think they're not quite as muscled as the shorter sprinter dogs. They don't have as big a bulging muscles. I've gone with a slightly more husky, because they're going to be out a little bit longer. We're going to be in the colder weather for longer, so I wanted a little more coat. So I'm specifically going for dogs that have a little more husky in them. I still have some hounds, and I just have to dress them appropriately. I mean, I put my dogs in sweaters and belly blankets when it's too cold, or we simply won't race when it gets too cold, because I do recognize that I have short-haired dogs, and we might not be appropriate racing down to -20. So I have a very structured cutoff limit for my dogs of what type of conditions we're willing to race in. And, temperature is a factor, because these hound husky mixes that we use don't have that traditional Siberian husky, heavy coated dogs, multi-coated dogs.
Todd, I have a couple of questions for you. I don't think you and I have ever met, but it's real refreshing to hear this kind of anthropological, philosophical approach to dog mushing. I really like to hear that. And I think that's really going to play into our second question. But my first question to you is, kind of quickly, because we're running out of time, but you live in a kind of a distance mushing hotbed over there in Knik, and you are a sprint musher. For folks that are not involved with mushing themselves, so they don't know the difference between the two in terms of training and tracks and trails and whatnot, how do you find your niche over there with, trails that are much different than Chugiak or other very groomed trails down here?
Well, and so let me touch on that quickly by just explaining the difference in trails that we're looking at. Distance mushers will often take a snow machine after a fresh snow, and they'll run through where they want to train, and they'll just pack it down with a snow machine, and they'll drive out and drive back maybe, and they'll just kind of put in like a rough, rutted kind of trail. And that's perfectly fine for distance teams because they're going 6, 7, 8 miles an hour. So the dogs can kind of move around some of those obstacles in the trail, smaller bumps and chunks of ice and snow that might be in the trail. When you start getting up into 14, 15 miles an hour, you need a much smoother trail. So when we are looking at Chugiak, like you said, or the Fur Rondy trail, we often equate the trail to highway. Like, oh, this is almost a highway level trail, meaning it's flat, it's polished. We spend an innumerous amount of time grooming. I know Kourosh is one of the groomers for the Chugiak trail system. Groomers spend more time on the trail than mushers do. We can spend hours and hours and hours doing the same circle over and over and over again so the dogs can go do it once. Being in Iditarod land, I live about a block and a half from the historic Iditarod Trail, so my training leaves my yard. I run along one of the roads in my town, on the edge of the road, and then I get on the Iditarod Trail. And the first 3 miles of the Iditarod Trail is a distance trail that I am trying to teach my neighbors to just make it a little bit nicer so that we can have more access to different types of dog teams training in the area. So I'm trying to get a slightly more groomed trail in. The nice thing about where I live is I'm 3 miles away from the Aurora sprint track. So I only have to get 3 miles before I'm on a sprint quality track that's maintained by the Aurora Sprinting Club, which is amazing because I'm not just having to, groom a 20-mile track myself so that I can go run my own dogs 20 miles. I'm able to connect in with an established trail and get those bigger miles in without having to do 100% of the work. But the distance community that I've been around has been very supportive of me being there. It's been very nice. Sometimes their advice doesn't work because I don't get far enough out on the trails to take their advice when they tell me that I don't want to go on this lake. Well, I don't even know where that lake is because that lake's 60 miles an hour, 60 miles away. I'm never getting anywhere near that lake. I did a 30-mile run on accident once, and that's about as far as I want to go with my dog team.
Excellent. Todd, one last question before we go, and that's the question I ask all of our guests, and that is, if a person comes to you for one piece of advice, you've got a lot of historical experience behind you there. What would you tell them?
If you want to get into a dog team, get into mushing, honestly, especially these days, I would say the first step is go learn how to bike jor with your dog. Learning how to do the dryland racing is the fundamental way to learn mushing. And I think it's probably one of the most important events that we've seen in the mushing community in the last 20 years. The transition into dryland, you're using small teams, you're in better weather, so you're on dirt, you're in the fall time. It's not freezing cold. There are dryland races popping up all around the world. You don't have to live in an Arctic environment to race dogs. And really, I think people should try smaller teams. 1, 2, 3 dog teams is fun. You can do it with your pets. You don't need to spend tons of money on it. It's a very accessible way to get into dog mushing. And I would say that that's my number one piece of advice. The second piece of advice, find a mentor. Yep.
We hear that one. We hear that one a lot. Todd, we've had about 110 or so guests on, and I don't think anybody's ever given the advice to start in dry land. So that's really interesting to hear that, and I really like that because I think that sort of is the future of the sport. Thank you very much for joining us. KP, anything in closing?
Todd, wanted to thank you for the last 20 or some minutes with us. Good luck to you and your dog team for the upcoming season. I will hopefully see you on the avenue. Thank you.
I hope so too. Thank you very much, guys. And Kourosh, hopefully one day you'll be looking over my shoulder at me.
Will do.
Very good. All right. On behalf of our guest,
guys. Thank you.
Yep. On behalf of our guest today and my co-host, KP, this is Robert for the Dog Driver Show. We will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by First Paw Coffee Company. Learn more at firstpaw.coffee.
From First Paw Media, this is the Dog Driver Show. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you can see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Robert Forto and Kourosh Partow. Our producer is Robert Forto and created for First Paw Media.